Part 2. The jungle stood still around them, thick and suffocating, as if time itself had frozen. The figure with the black eyes continued to stare, unblinking, its face expressionless. But its gaze was heavy, pressing down on James like an unseen weight. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs felt like stone, frozen in place by fear. Diego's grip tightened on his arm, but his eyes were calm, betraying no hint of panic. Instead, he slowly began to back away, guiding James with careful, deliberate steps. "Don't make any sudden movements," Diego whispered in a low, steady voice. "We need to leave, now." The tension in the air was suffocating. Every rustle of leaves felt like a shout in the silence. James could barely breathe, every breath shallow and quick, his heart pounding in his chest. He dared not take his eyes off the figure in the clearing, but as they retreated, the figure did not move. And then, as quickly as it had started, the moment passed. The figure turned back to the fire, its attention seemingly diverted, its chanting resuming in soft, rhythmic waves. James let out a long breath, his legs shaking with the weight of the fear that had almost paralyzed him. "What the hell was that?" he breathed, barely able to form the words. Diego didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the shadows around them. "I told you not to come here." His voice was harsh, but it held a note of regret, maybe even fear. "They are not just people. They are something else." James shook his head, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding his thoughts. "What are they? What do they want?" Diego hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a low voice, almost as if he was afraid to say the words aloud. "They are a lost tribe, yes, but they have been changed, altered by something older, something dark. They perform rituals to summon things. They are the guardians of this land, the jungle. You saw what they did. It's not just magic, it's real." James struggled to process what Diego had said. "You mean they're connected to the jungle? To something in it?" Diego nodded grimly. "Not just connected, they are the jungle. It's a part of them. This place, it's not just remote, not just isolated. There's power here. Dark, ancient power." A cold shiver ran down James's spine. He had heard stories, of course, tales about tribes and rituals, but hearing it like this from Diego, someone who had lived and breathed the dangers of the Amazon, it felt too real. Diego gestured toward the jungle. "We need to get out of here. We've pushed too far already. If they notice us again, they'll track us, and then we won't have any chance of escape." James nodded quickly, his mind racing. "Where do we go? How do we get back?" Diego surveyed the jungle ahead, his brow furrowed. "We stay on the edge of the river. We can follow it back to where we last crossed, but we have to be fast. If they know we're here, they'll find us." James swallowed hard, his eyes lingering one last time on the clearing where the figures sat. They hadn't moved, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, waiting. Diego took the lead, his machete cutting through the dense underbrush. James followed, every crack of a branch underfoot feeling like a signal, a giveaway. They moved quickly but cautiously, hearts pounding in the tense silence that seemed to hang between them like a tangible force. As they walked, James couldn't help but wonder, how far would they have to go to escape the dark grip of this cursed jungle? And even if they did, what would be left of them when they made it out? James and Diego pressed forward through the dense jungle, their movements cautious, their senses heightened. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The usual buzz of insects and distant calls of birds had faded into an eerie silence, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. James wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles tense. He felt exposed, like unseen eyes were tracking their every step. Diego, walking slightly ahead, kept his machete low, using it more to brush aside vines than for cutting. He moved with precision, his gaze flickering between the trees as if searching for something or someone. "We should be getting close to the river by now," James whispered. Diego didn't respond immediately. He slowed his pace, raising a hand for James to stop. His eyes locked onto the ground ahead. James followed his gaze and felt his stomach tighten. The dirt path they had been following was no longer just earth and fallen leaves. Strange symbols had been etched into the soil, circles, jagged lines, and spirals. The patterns were chaotic, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they held meaning. "What is this?" he asked in a hushed tone. Diego knelt down, brushing his fingers over the markings. His face was unreadable, but James could sense his unease. "A warning," Diego murmured. "These are not natural. People, put them here." James glanced around, his pulse quickening. The jungle had always felt overwhelming, but now it felt oppressive, as if it were slowly closing in around them. "Are we being followed?" he asked. Diego exhaled slowly, standing up. "Maybe. Or maybe they're letting us know we've gone too far." A heavy silence hung between them. James felt a prickle on the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. "We should turn back," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. Diego hesitated, looking at the markings one last time before nodding. Carefully. No sudden moves. As they retraced their steps, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just explorers lost in the jungle. They were intruders, ones who had wandered too deep into something they were never meant to see. James and Diego moved slowly, retracing their steps with deliberate care. The eerie silence of the jungle made every rustling leaf and snapping twig beneath their feet feel deafening. James fought the urge to look over his shoulder every few seconds, convinced that something, or someone, was watching them from the dense foliage. "Stay calm," Diego whispered. "We don't run unless we have to." James nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. The unsettling symbols they had found moments ago still burned in his mind. Who had carved them into the earth? What did they mean? He had read about isolated tribes deep in the Amazon, ones that had never made contact with the outside world. Could they have stumbled into forbidden territory? They walked for what felt like hours, though James knew it was only minutes. The jungle ahead seemed unchanged, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, like the very air had thickened with unseen tension. Then Diego stopped abruptly. "Do you see that?" he whispered, barely moving his lips. James followed Diego's gaze to a massive tree trunk a few feet away. At first, it looked like nothing more than a tangle of vines and moss. But then, James saw it. Hidden among the twisting roots, nearly blending into the tree itself, was a small bundle. A collection of sticks tied together with thin twine, feathers jutting out from the sides. Small animal bones dangled from its center, clinking softly as a faint breeze passed through. It was a totem. James swallowed hard. That wasn't here before. Diego's expression darkened. No, it wasn't. James took a cautious step backward, scanning the trees. He couldn't see anything, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. A cold bead of sweat trickled down his back. "They know we're here," Diego murmured. James clenched his fists. "We need to leave. Now." Diego nodded. They turned and moved as quickly and quietly as they could, stepping over roots and ducking beneath thick branches. Every fiber of James's being screamed at him to run, but he fought the impulse. If someone or something was watching them, sudden movement might provoke a reaction they wouldn't be able to escape. A low rustling sound echoed from behind them. James's breath hitched. He didn't turn around. Neither did Diego. They kept walking, faster now, moving toward the direction they had come from, praying that the jungle would let them go. The humidity in the air thickened, and James felt a shift in the atmosphere. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves with a frantic energy. Above the dense canopy, the sky darkened ominously, signaling an approaching storm. "We need to find shelter," Diego muttered, glancing up at the forming storm clouds. "This is going to be a bad one." James wiped the sweat from his forehead, his nerves still on edge after discovering the totem. The oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't left him, but as the storm clouds churned, a new sensation settled in: urgency. The jungle wasn't just dangerous because of its hidden inhabitants. Nature itself was a force they couldn't ignore. Thunder rumbled in the distance, sending a deep vibration through the ground. The first heavy drops of rain splattered against their skin, quickly turning into a downpour. "There!" Diego suddenly pointed toward a rocky outcrop partially concealed by thick vegetation. James followed Diego's lead, pushing through the wet foliage. As they got closer, they saw a dark opening at the base of the rock formation. A cave. The rain intensified, hammering down on them as they ducked into the entrance. Inside, the air was cool and damp, but it was a welcome refuge from the storm. Water dripped from their clothes, forming small puddles at their feet. James took out his flashlight and swept the beam across the walls. The cave was larger than he expected, stretching further into darkness. The ground was uneven but dry, and there were no immediate signs of dangerous wildlife inside. Diego exhaled heavily, shaking off the rain from his arms. "Looks like we got lucky." James wasn't so sure. His mind was still fixated on the totem, on the unseen figures he was sure had been watching them. But for now, the pounding rain outside masked any other sounds. Maybe, just maybe, the tribe had lost track of them in the chaos of the storm. Or maybe they were simply waiting. James sat against the rough stone wall, listening to the relentless downpour. The jungle outside was alive with the sounds of rain drumming against leaves and the occasional crack of thunder. The storm had bought them some time. But deep inside he knew this was only temporary. The relentless rain showed no signs of stopping. The wind howled through the jungle, carrying with it the distant echoes of snapping branches and rustling leaves. James and Diego sat near the entrance of the cave, their bodies finally starting to dry from the earlier downpour. The fire they had hastily built flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the damp stone walls. James leaned against the rough surface, exhaustion weighing on his muscles. Despite his fatigue, his mind refused to rest. He turned to Diego, who was sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "Diego," James began, his voice quieter than usual. "Back in the village before we left, you mentioned stories about the uncontacted tribes. You said some of them perform rituals." Diego's hands stilled. He glanced up, his face illuminated by the glow of the fire. "Si," he said after a long pause. "I have heard many things." James shifted forward. Diego exhaled deeply and set the knife down. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking. "There are tribes deep in the Amazon that no outsider has ever spoken to and lived to tell the story," he began. "Some say they are protectors of the jungle. Others believe they are something far more sinister." The fire crackled between them. "What kind of rituals do they perform?" James pressed. Diego ran a hand through his damp hair, his eyes dark with thought. "I've heard stories from old hunters, those who ventured too far and returned changed, if they returned at all. These tribes worship the spirits of the jungle, believing that the rainforest itself is alive, filled with forces beyond human understanding. They perform rituals to communicate with these spirits, to gain their favor or their power." James felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Power?" Diego nodded. "Some say they can control nature itself, summon animals, change the weather. Others whisper of darker things, curses, transformations, even the ability to walk between this world and another." James swallowed hard. He thought back to the totems, the strange markings on the trees, and the eerie sensation of being watched. It all seemed to align with what Diego was saying. "And the sacrifices?" James asked hesitantly. Diego hesitated before answering. "Blood offerings. Some say they give parts of themselves to the jungle, others say they take from outsiders." His gaze flickered toward the cave entrance, where the rain still poured in heavy sheets. "The ones who go missing are never found." James clenched his jaw. He suddenly felt very aware of how deep they were in the wilderness, how far from safety they had truly wandered. The jungle outside roared with the storm, but inside the cave, a heavy silence settled between them. "Let's get some rest," Diego finally said, his voice quieter now. "We'll need our strength for tomorrow." James nodded, though he wasn't sure how much sleep he would actually get, because now for the first time, he wasn't just afraid of getting lost. He was afraid of being found. James awoke to the faint sound of movement near the cave entrance. His body tensed as his senses adjusted to the dim morning light. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and earth, and the fire they had built the night before had nearly burned out, leaving only faintly glowing embers. Diego was already awake, crouched near the entrance, watching something outside with intense focus. His breath was slow and measured, his posture rigid. James carefully moved beside him, careful not to make a sound. When he followed Diego's gaze, his stomach twisted. Just beyond the tree line, the uncontacted tribe had gathered again. But this time, it wasn't just silent observation. They were performing a ritual. A small fire crackled at the center of the gathering, its flames sending flickering shadows across their painted faces. The tribespeople moved in synchronized motions, swaying side to side, whispering in low, rhythmic voices. Some held intricately carved wooden masks shaped like the faces of animals, monkeys, jaguars, and birds. Others had smeared a dark, clay-like substance over their arms and faces. The shaman, an older man with deep-set eyes and a headdress of woven vines and feathers, stepped into the center of the circle. He held a small clay bowl filled with a thick, dark liquid. He dipped his fingers into it and began tracing intricate patterns on his chest and arms, humming in a low tone that sent chills down James's spine. One by one, the other tribespeople followed. They smeared the dark substance onto their own skin, painting symbols and shapes that seemed almost alive in the firelight. Their chanting grew louder, echoing through the trees like a hypnotic melody. Then, something strange happened. One of the men let out a deep, guttural breath and stumbled forward, gripping his arms as if in pain. His body trembled violently. His fingers curled, his back arched, and for a moment, James thought he was having a seizure. But then, right before their eyes, his form began to shift. His muscles twitched unnaturally, his spine curved, and his face contorted. It wasn't an illusion. His body was physically changing. His arms shrank, his legs bent at odd angles, and his fingers became shorter, more nimble. Patches of fur sprouted along his limbs. His mouth pushed forward into a small snout. His ears grew rounded. Within seconds, where the man once stood, there was now a monkey. James' breath caught in his throat. He felt a chill run down his spine as he stared, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The monkey, formerly a man, let out a sharp cry and leaped onto a low-hanging branch. It looked at the others, tilting its head as if still aware of its former self. But there was no fear in its eyes. The ritual continued. More of the tribespeople stepped forward, smearing the substance over their bodies. One by one, they trembled, convulsed, and shifted. The air around them seemed charged with something unnatural, something beyond human understanding. James turned to Diego, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you seeing this?" Diego nodded slowly, his face pale. This is not just a ritual. This is something else." James swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The jungle had felt strange before, but now it felt utterly alien. They were no longer just observers. They were witnessing something that should have been impossible. James tore his gaze away from the surreal sight unfolding before them and turned to Diego. His companion's face was pale, his breathing unsteady. For the first time since their journey had begun, Diego looked truly shaken. "Diego, what the hell is happening?" James whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Diego swallowed hard, still watching as yet another tribesman trembled, his body shifting, limbs shortening, bones reshaping. In mere moments, a second monkey darted up into the trees, vanishing into the jungle canopy as if it had always belonged there. Diego finally tore his eyes away and looked at James, his expression conflicted. "I've heard about this before, but I never thought it was real." James narrowed his eyes. "Heard about what?" Diego hesitated for a moment, then exhaled sharply, as if resigning himself to a truth he had long tried to forget. "My father, he used to tell me stories when I was a kid, about the tribes deep in the Amazon, the ones no outsider has ever truly seen. He always said there were those who could change." James stiffened. "Change? You mean into animals?" Diego nodded. He called them the curse-born, the ones who were chosen, or maybe condemned, to take the shape of the jungle itself. He said the transformation was part of a ritual, something tied to the spirits of the land. But I always thought they were just myths, scary bedtime stories meant to keep kids from wandering too deep into the rainforest. James clenched his jaw. "Well, it's not a bedtime story anymore." They both turned their eyes back toward the tribe. The ritual was still in progress. More figures were shifting, some into monkeys, others into birds. One man crouched near the fire, let out a deep groan before his form stretched unnaturally. A moment later, his body melted into the shape of a jaguar, sleek and powerful. The massive feline blinked slowly, then prowled into the shadows of the trees, disappearing into the night. Diego inhaled sharply. "My father said they weren't just transforming for the sake of it. He said they did this to protect something." James felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Protect what?" Diego shook his head. "I don't know. He never told me. Or maybe he didn't know himself." A heavy silence fell between them. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects and rustling leaves. But now, those sounds felt different. as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching them just as they had been watching the tribe. James clenched his fists. They had spent days running, hiding, trying to stay unnoticed. But now, as he watched humans become creatures before his very eyes, he realized something chilling. They weren't just lost in the jungle anymore. They had stumbled into something ancient, something forbidden. And now, the question remained, had the tribe noticed them? And if they had, what would happen next? James and Diego remained completely still, their bodies tense as they observed the strange ritual unfold before them. The tribe continued their eerie transformations, men turning into animals, blending seamlessly with the jungle as if they had never been human at all. The flickering fire cast long shadows across the damp cave walls, making the entire scene feel even more surreal. James gritted his teeth, waiting for the inevitable moment when one of them would turn their gaze toward the cave. He expected sharp eyes to pierce the darkness, sensing their presence, calling out in alarm. But that moment never came. The tribe never looked in their direction. They moved methodically through their ritual, each participant seemingly lost in their own world. Slowly, as if obeying an unspoken command, the transformed figures disappeared into the jungle. The fire crackled one last time before the remaining tribespeople covered it with earth, extinguishing its glow. The clearing darkened, the last remnants of their presence fading into the whispers of the rainforest. Then, just like that, they were gone. James let out a slow, shaky breath. Did they not see us? Diego hesitated, his gaze still locked on the now empty clearing. I don't know. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe we weren't part of whatever they were doing. James exhaled, running a hand through his damp, unkempt hair. Either way, we can't stay here. If they come back. I know. Diego cut in, already grabbing his gear. We should move before the sun rises. Carefully, they stepped toward the cave entrance. The humid night air greeted them, thick with the scent of wet leaves and earth. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a ghostly mist that slithered between the towering trees. The jungle was eerily silent, as if even the animals were waiting for something. James felt a deep unease settle in his chest. He had expected to feel relief now that the tribe was gone, but instead, a lingering dread clung to him. What they had witnessed wasn't just some strange cultural ritual. It was something far older, something beyond their understanding. As they made their way out of the cave, James turned to Diego. Which way now? Diego hesitated, then pointed toward the dense foliage. We keep heading east. If we're lucky, we'll find the river again. James gave a firm nod. Then let's get the hell out of here. With one last glance back at the empty clearing, they disappeared into the jungle, the mysteries of the tribe still weighing heavily on their minds. The dense jungle seemed to press in on them from all sides as James and Diego carefully made their way through the underbrush. The wet, slick ground made every step treacherous, and their clothes clung to their skin, heavy with moisture from the rainstorm. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves felt like it might draw attention, though whether from the tribe or the jungle's unseen predators, they couldn't be sure. The night was thick with shadows, and the silence that followed the tribe's departure felt almost suffocating. James kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses heightened, expecting to see something, anything, that would make them stop and hide. But there was nothing. The jungle was still. Diego, leading the way with quiet urgency, occasionally paused to listen to the sounds around them. We're not far now, he murmured after a particularly long silence, his voice tight with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The river should be just through here. James nodded, but his mind kept drifting back to the ritual they had witnessed. The images of the transformed figures, moving effortlessly between man and beast, were burned into his memory. How could they have done that? And why had they seemed so indifferent to their presence? The unanswered questions gnawed at him, making the weight of the jungle feel even heavier. They pushed forward, careful not to make too much noise. The path was narrow and tangled with vines, but every now and then, Diego would catch a glimpse of the faint glint of water through the trees. Almost there, he whispered, though James wasn't sure if he was speaking to himself or to James. Another hour passed. The jungle seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each step, the air thick with moisture and the lingering scent of the rain. Yet, Despite the eerie atmosphere, James felt a strange sense of relief. If they could just reach the river, they would be able to find their bearings and, hopefully, get back to the village or find help. Finally, through the heavy canopy, they saw it, the river. A wide, slow-moving stream, its waters dark and muddy after the rain. The sound of the river's flow was like music to their ears after the tension of the jungle. It was a lifeline. James exhaled deeply. "We made it," he muttered, stepping closer to the bank and kneeling down to splash his face with the cool, fresh water. The sense of accomplishment was brief, though. The river, while a relief, was also a reminder that they were still very much in the heart of the Amazon. They weren't safe yet. Diego joined him by the water, squatting beside him. "We need to follow it upstream," he said, his tone firm but tired. "It'll lead us toward the next village. But we need to move fast before—" He trailed off, his eyes darting back into the dark jungle. James glanced at him, feeling the same unease. "Before the tribe comes back." Diego didn't answer, but James could see it in his eyes. They both knew that the tribe, if it even cared to find them, could easily track them through the jungle. The sense of danger hadn't dissipated, and it wouldn't until they were far away from this place. With no more words between them, they both stood up, their eyes still scanning the jungle as they slowly began to follow the river upstream. The night was far from over, and the dangers of the Amazon had not yet revealed their full face. The darkness of the jungle seemed endless, the weight of it pressing in on them as they made their way along the riverbank. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but the air was thick and humid, and their clothes clung to them like a second skin. Every step they took felt heavier than the last, their legs sore from the hours of walking through the dense, wet jungle. James's exhaustion had begun to settle in, his body aching from the constant tension and the strain of the journey. His mind was foggy, the haunting images of the ritual and the transformation still fresh in his mind. Despite their narrow escape, his thoughts kept circling back to the tribe, what they could do, what they were capable of. He hadn't been able to shake the unsettling feeling that something was watching them, even when they thought they were alone. Diego, too, looked worn out. His face was grim, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The sense of urgency in his movements had faded, replaced by a quiet weariness. The journey had taken a toll on both of them, and the exhaustion was beginning to set in. After what seemed like another hour of walking, Diego suddenly stopped. He looked over at James, his expression tired but resolute. "We need to rest," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's too far to the camp tonight. We're not going to make it." James hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the dark jungle. He was reluctant to stop, not wanting to risk being caught by the tribe or any other danger lurking nearby. But his body ached, and the weight of the situation had taken its toll. "I agree," he said quietly. "We'll stay here for the night. We'll need to be strong for tomorrow." They found a spot on the riverbank, sheltered by a thick cluster of trees. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover from the elements. The sound of the river flowing softly beside them was oddly soothing, a quiet contrast to the tension in the air. James sank down onto the ground, feeling the cool, damp earth against his legs. His eyes closed for a moment, and he couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. The sound of the water and the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze offered a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. It was a fleeting comfort, but it was enough. Diego, sitting nearby, seemed equally grateful for the moment of rest. He pulled his legs close to his chest and stared out at the river, lost in thought. "I never thought it would come to this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I never thought we'd see anything like this. What kind of people are they?" James opened his eyes and turned to him. "I don't know, Diego, but I don't think we can stay here much longer. We're too close to them. Too close to whatever that was." His voice trailed off as the memory of the ritual flashed before his eyes again. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They both just sat there, listening to the river and watching the shadows of the trees stretch long across the ground. The exhaustion from the journey was finally catching up with them, and despite the fear gnawing at the back of James's mind, his body craved rest. After a few more minutes of silence, Diego stretched out on the ground beside the river, pulling his jacket tighter around him for warmth. "We need to sleep. "We'll figure things out in the morning," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. James nodded, though his mind was still racing. Sleep would be a welcome relief, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead kept him from fully relaxing. The jungle wasn't done with them yet. But for now, there was nothing they could do but rest. Tomorrow, they would have to keep moving, keep pushing forward. James lay back, his eyes scanning the dark sky above, and tried to push the thoughts of the tribe and the strange, terrifying magic out of his mind. Sleep came slowly, but eventually the exhaustion took over, and the river's gentle sound lulled them both into an uneasy slumber. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The jungle around them was eerily still, the usual chorus of birds and insects momentarily silent. James slowly opened his eyes, feeling the lingering tension in the air. The calmness felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. He could hear Diego shifting beside him, but his senses were on high alert. A rustling sound broke the silence, a soft, cautious movement in the underbrush. James's body tensed. He wasn't sure if it was an animal, the wind, or something else entirely, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He could feel Diego's eyes snap open as well, both of them instinctively becoming aware of the growing tension. From the corner of his eye, James saw a pair of glowing eyes watching them from a few yards away. His heart skipped a beat. At first, he thought it might have been a trick of the light, but as the figure stepped forward into the shadows of the trees, he realized what it was. A jaguar. Its sleek, muscular body was poised in the undergrowth, its golden eyes locked onto them with an intensity that sent a chill down James's spine. The jaguar's coat blended seamlessly with the jungle around it. And for a moment, James couldn't tell if it was real or if it was part of the dreamlike world they had been trapped in. Diego's hand shot to the machete at his side, his grip tightening around the handle. His voice was a low whisper, but it carried the urgency of someone who had seen too much in too little time. "It's watching us," he murmured, barely audible. "I don't like this, James. Could be more than just an animal." James nodded slowly, his mind racing. "It's too aware. Do you think it's one of them? From the contact tribe?" The thought made his stomach turn. The idea that the jaguar might not be an animal at all, but a human in disguise was a terrifying possibility. The line between the natural and the supernatural was becoming increasingly blurry. The jaguar didn't move, its eyes unwavering. It was as if it was studying them, assessing their every move, as though it knew something they didn't. "Maybe it's just a jaguar," James said quietly, though doubt lingered in his voice. "But why isn't it attacking? Why just watching?" Diego clenched his machete tighter, his knuckles white. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. They could feel the weight of the jaguar's gaze, a quiet, predatory presence that seemed to pierce through them. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. Finally, after what felt like hours, the jaguar made its move. But it wasn't an attack. Instead, it slowly backed away into the thick undergrowth, its eyes still locked onto them as it retreated. It was as though it had decided they weren't worth the trouble. Or perhaps it was waiting for something. Either way, the jaguar was leaving them for now. Diego lowered his machete, but didn't relax. His eyes remained trained on the spot where the jaguar had been. "That wasn't just an animal, James. I don't know what it was, but I don't trust it." James swallowed, his heart still racing. "Neither do I. But it didn't attack. That's something." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the aftershock of their encounter, and it felt like the jungle itself was holding its breath. James wondered if this was just another test. He thought about the strange rituals, the magic they had witnessed, and the transformations that had haunted their journey. What if this jaguar was connected to all of it? "We need to keep moving," Diego said finally, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here, not with whatever that was out there." James nodded in agreement, though his mind was still reeling from the encounter. As they packed their things, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even now. Something was out there, and it wasn't just the jungle. The jaguar had retreated, but the mystery of what they were facing in these woods had only deepened. They both knew they had to be careful. The line between the natural and the supernatural was becoming dangerously thin, and they had no idea what was waiting for them next. As the morning progressed, James and Diego made their way along the narrow path leading back toward their camp. The sounds of the jungle seemed to have returned to their usual rhythm, birds calling and insects buzzing, but there was an underlying sense of unease in the air. They moved cautiously, each step taken with the weight of recent events hanging heavy on their shoulders. With every step, the feeling that they were being watched didn't leave them, but as they pushed further into the dense jungle, James noticed something strange. There were signs, footprints in the mud, fresh scratches on tree trunks, and broken branches along the path. The signs were new, too new to be from the jaguar. It seemed as though something or someone had passed through here recently. But there was no sign of danger, no immediate threat lurking in the shadows. "This doesn't feel right," Diego murmured, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We shouldn't be seeing these signs so clearly if we're still being watched. They're too clean, too obvious." James glanced over at him, his brow furrowing. "You're saying it's like they're letting us go?" Diego nodded slowly. "Exactly. I don't know why, but it's as if the jungle or the people here are just letting us pass. But why?" James couldn't answer. The idea of being allowed to leave felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. He had seen too much to believe that anything in this place happened without a reason. The strange encounters, the magic, the rituals, it all pointed to something much larger than they could understand. They continued along the path, moving cautiously but steadily. The sounds of the jungle began to feel more familiar, and the weight of the tension that had been clinging to them for days seemed to lift, ever so slightly. It was as though the jungle was shifting around them, opening up in a way it hadn't before. As they walked, James began to think back to the last few days, the strange magic they had witnessed, the transformations, and the way they had been watched so intently. Could it be possible that the tribe or the jungle had some kind of plan for them? That they had been allowed to witness these things for a reason? Or perhaps, more ominously, they were part of something larger, something beyond their understanding. "Maybe they don't want us to leave," James said quietly, voicing a thought that had been creeping into his mind. "Maybe they're just waiting for the right time." Diego didn't answer right away, his mind clearly racing with the same questions. He had seen enough of this place to know that there were layers to it, layers that could take a lifetime to understand, if ever. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being given some kind of freedom, freedom that might come at a steep cost later. The road ahead seemed clearer, less cluttered than before. The dense jungle that had been closing in around them now felt almost inviting, as if it were opening up, allowing them to pass through with little resistance. Eventually, they reached a clearing, the first they had seen in what felt like days. The sunlight broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It felt almost like a passage, a border between the unknown and the known, between the magic of the jungle and the safety of their camp. But even in this moment of relative calm, the question still loomed large in James's mind. Why had they been allowed to walk through this jungle without interference? What had the tribe seen in them, or perhaps in their journey, that had led them to this moment? "We need to keep going," Diego said, breaking James out of his thoughts. "We're not out of this yet." James nodded, though his mind was still far away. They continued down the path toward their camp, each step feeling like the beginning of a new chapter. But the feeling of being released, of being allowed to go, haunted him. Something was still watching them, and whatever it wasn't finished with them yet. For now, they would return to the safety of their camp. But James couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever had been watching them, whatever force had guided their path through the jungle, still had a purpose, and they would soon learn exactly what that purpose was. After days of tension and uncertainty, James and Diego finally made their way back to the camp where their journey had begun. The once foreboding jungle now seemed much quieter, its dense canopy casting long shadows over the path. The sound of the Amazon's wildlife was no longer accompanied by the lurking fear of being watched. The tribe was far behind them now, deep in the thick, untraveled parts of the forest. The danger had receded, leaving only the remnants of an unsettling experience in their minds. As they arrived at the camp, a feeling of immense relief washed over them. The familiar faces of other tourists and guides brought a sense of safety they had longed for. The camp, which had once seemed like a simple starting point, now felt like a sanctuary. The bustling atmosphere around the fire and the sound of other travelers preparing for their own expeditions filled the air. James and Diego settled by the fire, their tired bodies grateful for the familiar comfort of the camp. They both stared into the flames for a long moment, each silently processing the events of the last few days. "It's hard to believe it's finally over," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost as if he were trying to make sense of what had happened. That tribe, the rituals, it all feels so unreal now. Diego nodded in agreement, though his face remained thoughtful. "Yeah, it's like a bad dream. But it wasn't. It really happened." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I never imagined something like that could exist out here. I've been to many places, but nothing like this." They both fell into silence again, watching the flames dance in the fire. The camp had become a place of normalcy, a stark contrast to the wild, unknown world they had just left behind. Yet, neither of them could shake the strange feeling that something profound had occurred, something that had changed them. "Do you think we'll ever truly understand what we saw?" James asked after a while. "I don't know," Diego replied. "I've heard stories before, but I never thought any of it was real. I always thought those were just legends. My father told me about the rituals of the Amazon tribes, but he never mentioned anything about the transformations." James leaned forward, his face serious. The transformation, it was the most terrifying part. Becoming something else, something not human. It was like we were just pawns in some ancient game. But I have to admit, there was something mesmerizing about it too. Like maybe we're not supposed to understand it all. Diego remained silent for a moment, his mind drifting back to the ritual they had witnessed, the way the tribe had chanted, the eerie movements, the power they had seemed to wield. It was something that didn't belong in the modern world, something that existed only in the deepest corners of human imagination. "Maybe it's just better that we don't understand it," Diego finally said. "Maybe it's a part of this world we don't need to touch. We saw enough." James agreed, and they both sat back, letting the heat from the fire warm their tired bodies. The jungle was no longer a place of danger, but the memories of what they had encountered would linger. They had escaped the grip of the tribe, but the knowledge of what they had witnessed in the Amazon would stay with them forever. For now, though, they were safe. The tribe was far behind them, lost in the depths of the forest, and the world outside the jungle awaited them. They could rest, reflect, and soon return to their lives with the strange and terrifying experience of the Amazon forever etched into their memories. The fire crackled, the sound of the jungle night blending with the murmur of the other travelers around them. As they sat in the warmth of the fire, they knew their journey had ended. But the questions it had raised would remain unanswered, hidden in the shadows of the Amazon. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, James turned to Diego with a thoughtful expression on his face. The flickering flames cast shadows on their faces, and the sounds of the camp around them felt distant, almost like a dream. The jungle had a strange hold on their thoughts, and though they were safe now, their experiences felt incomplete, unfinished. "You know, Diego," James began cautiously, "we could go back, go down that path we weren't supposed to take, the one that led to the tribe. We could see them again, maybe even learn more about what happened. Maybe we didn't fully understand it all, but we could try." Diego stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he considered the idea. He had been quiet for some time, his mind working through the events of the past days, but this suggestion, this idea of returning, made his stomach churn. "James." Diego's voice was firm, with a hint of warning. "We can't. You saw what happened out there, the ritual, the way they transformed. That wasn't something we should have witnessed. That was their world, their power. If we go back, this time they won't just let us leave." James leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "But think about it. We saw something no one else has, something beyond belief. What if we can understand it, document it, maybe even—" Diego cut him off. his tone growing more serious, almost urgent. No, James. We barely made it out alive. Do you honestly think they'd just let us go back, knowing what we've seen? If we try to return, they'll see us as a threat, something that could expose them, something they can't let live. This isn't just curiosity. It's dangerous. You saw what they were capable of. They might have let us go this time, but next time, they won't be so merciful. James hesitated, the weight of Diego's words sinking in. His enthusiasm began to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. They had survived. But at what cost? The tribe was powerful, and their customs were far beyond anything they had ever imagined. What had seemed like an adventure was, in hindsight, a brush with something far darker and more mysterious than either of them had understood at the time. I get it, James muttered, leaning back against a nearby log. I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to discover. But you're right, we shouldn't go back. Diego nodded, his eyes weary as he looked toward the jungle in the distance. The night was quiet, but the memories of their encounter with the tribe still lingered in the air like a fog. Sometimes, James, he said softly, it's better not to know. Not everything needs to be uncovered. We got close to something we shouldn't have. Let's leave it at that. James stared at the fire for a long moment, his mind wrestling with the temptation to return, to uncover more of the mystery that had shaken them both. But Diego was right. There was no coming back from what they had seen, and some things were best left untouched. They sat in silence for a while longer, the fire crackling between them. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people understand something deeply, something that cannot be put into words. They had ventured into the heart of the unknown, and they had barely escaped with their lives. The jungle, with all its secrets, had shown them its power, and now it was time to leave it behind. The tribe was gone, lost to the shadows of the Amazon. James and Diego would never forget what they had witnessed, but they had learned an important lesson. Some paths were meant to remain closed. Some mysteries were too dangerous to unravel. And now, as the fire burned low and the sounds of the jungle faded into the night, they knew that the best thing they could do was to leave the Amazon behind and never look back. The sun was beginning to rise over the distant hills, casting a soft golden light over the camp. The fire had burned out, leaving only the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. The sounds of the jungle had quieted for the morning, replaced by the quiet chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt like a new beginning, the dawn of a new chapter. James sat on a log, looking down at his gear, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the past few days. His backpack was packed and ready to go. The adventure had come to an end. It was time to leave the jungle behind. He felt a strange sense of relief mixed with regret. There was so much he still wanted to understand, so much he still wanted to know. But Diego was right. Some things were better left alone. Diego approached slowly, his face tired but calm. He had been up since the early hours, preparing his own things, checking their equipment one last time. He looked at James, offering a small but genuine smile. "You ready?" Diego asked, his voice steady, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. James nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I guess I am. It's time to go home." Diego sat down beside him, his gaze lingering on the jungle beyond. "You'll be fine back home, James. It's easy to get lost out here. But where you're going, you've got a chance to find your way again." James nodded, looking around at the camp, at the place where everything had changed for him. It felt like a lifetime ago that they had first arrived, ready to explore the unknown. Now, that unknown felt like a shadow he could never escape. "I'll miss you, man," James said quietly. "I never thought I'd get so close to something like this. But I'm glad I had someone like you with me, someone who knew when to stop." Diego smiled faintly, clapping James on the back. "I'll miss you too. You've got a good heart, James. Just don't go chasing ghosts when you get back. The Amazon has a way of pulling people in, and it's hard to let go." James stood, adjusting his pack and taking a deep breath. "I'll try, but I'm going back to what I know. I'm going to put this all behind me." Diego stood as well, holding out his hand. "Take care, James. Stay safe." James shook his hand firmly. "You too, Diego. Stay out of the jungle, all right?" Diego gave him a final nod, watching as James turned to leave. The path ahead was long, and the journey back to civilization felt almost surreal. The jungle, with its mysteries and dangers, was behind him now. The tribe, the rituals, the transformations, they were all part of a world he couldn't understand, a world that had changed him in ways he wasn't sure how to explain. But as he walked away, he realized that some stories weren't meant to be told, and some places were meant to remain untouched. James made his way through the forest, the weight of the journey heavy on his shoulders. He didn't look back. There was nothing left for him in the Amazon. The jungle had given him its secrets, and now it was time for him to leave them behind. As he arrived at the clearing where the boat waited to take him back to the city, he paused one last time to look out at the jungle. The vast green expanse seemed endless, full of unknowns. But James was done with it now. He had lived the adventure, and now it was time to return home. He boarded the boat, leaving the Amazon behind. The boat began to move down the river, slowly disappearing into the distance, the jungle receding into the past. The Amazon would always be there, hiding its secrets, its mysteries, its magic. But for James, it was over. The adventure had ended. And as he sailed away, a part of him knew that the memories of the jungle would never leave him. They would stay with him, quietly haunting him as a reminder of the dangers of the unknown and the wisdom of knowing when to let go. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.